At a gas station in suburban America, the first warning does not look like a macroeconomic event. It looks like a number on a pump, a number that suddenly feels too high again. For months, many Americans were hoping the worst of the inflation wave was behind them. The economy was still carrying pressure, but there was a growing belief that maybe the next chapter would finally be about relief. Relief on fuel, relief on groceries, relief on interest rates, relief on borrowing costs. But oil has a way of changing the mood of the entire economy faster than almost any other commodity. And right now, oil is rising again because the geopolitical risk is not fading. It is intensifying. That is why this video matters. Because the real question is not just whether gas gets more expensive. The real question is whether this oil shock can push inflation back up just enough to keep the Federal Reserve trapped in a higher-for-longer position. And if that happens, then the damage does not stop at the pump. It moves into credit cards, car loans, small business borrowing, housing affordability, consumer confidence, and growth itself. So here is the big promise. By the end of this video, you will understand why an oil shock is never just an energy story. It is an inflation story, a Fed story, and potentially a household stress story all over again. This matters now because the U.S. is not entering this oil spike from a position of clean disinflation. Inflation has cooled from its old peaks, but is not fully dead. And that is exactly what makes an oil shock dangerous in this moment. If inflation were already back at target and deeply stable, an energy spike might be easier for policymakers to look through. But when inflation is still sitting above the Fed's comfort zone, even a narrower energy shock can become a policy problem. And there is another reason this matters now. Americans do not experience inflation through charts first. They experience it through routines. The commute, the school run, the delivery fee, the truck that moves food, the diesel cost buried inside almost everything else. So this is not a theoretical macro discussion. The price signal is already hitting household life. What is actually happening is that the market is repricing energy risk upward because traders no longer believe this shock will fade quickly. The immediate trigger is geopolitical tension and the growing fear of disruption in one of the world's most important energy choke points. But that does not mean the United States suddenly runs out of fuel. That is the wrong mental model. The first break is usually not a dramatic shortage. It is a repricing of risk. Oil futures rise. Insurance and shipping costs rise. Refining margins can stay elevated. Wholesale fuel prices move. Then retail gasoline and diesel follow with a lag. And then the broader pass-through begins. This is important because crude oil still makes up the biggest share of what Americans pay for gasoline. So when crude jumps, the effect is not confined to oil traders. It enters the real economy through fuel. And that is exactly the kind of shock that can complicate the inflation picture. Not because every category in the CPI suddenly surges overnight, but because energy is one of the fastest ways to change both the direct cost structure of the economy and the psychological feeling that inflation is coming back. That psychological layer matters. Because the moment households and businesses begin to suspect that inflation is becoming sticky again, the policy environment becomes much harder. So how does the oil shock become a Fed problem? The chain is simple. War pressure becomes oil pressure. Oil pressure becomes fuel pressure. Fuel pressure becomes inflation pressure. Inflation pressure becomes Fed pressure. Fed pressure becomes growth pressure. Start with fuel. When oil rises, gasoline gets more expensive for households. And diesel gets more expensive for freight, logistics, construction, agriculture, and local distribution. That is where the second round effects begin. Diesel is not just a transport fuel. It is one of the hidden cost carriers inside the economy. If diesel stays high, shipping gets more expensive. If shipping gets more expensive, food distribution, retail logistics, warehouse operations, and service costs all begin to feel pressure. Some firms absorb part of that. Others pass it on. Either way, margins or households get squeezed. Then comes the inflation layer. At first, the hit is visible in headline inflation because energy, moves directly. But if the shock lasts, it can start bleeding into broader pricing behavior. Businesses that were hoping to stop raising prices may keep raising them. Consumers who thought inflation was cooling may start expecting higher costs again. And once expectations become less comfortable, the Fed has a harder job. That is the real trap. The Fed does not need oil to create a full 2022-style inflation wave in order to have a problem. It only needs oil to slow the path back to 2%. Because if inflation progress stalls, the central bank has less room to cut rates. And that matters in a system where borrowing costs already shape everything. Business expansion, auto affordability, mortgage demand. Then comes the growth layer. A household paying more for gas and essentials has less room for everything else. That means weaker discretionary spending. A small business facing higher delivery and operating costs has less flexibility. That means weaker hiring or weaker margins. A Fed that cannot ease as quickly as hoped means tighter financial conditions stay in place longer. That means slower credit-sensitive activity. So the oil shock does not need to destroy demand in one moment. It can grind it down. And that is why this kind of shock is so dangerous. It can push inflation and weaken growth at the same time. Not necessarily into classic stagflation immediately, but into a much more uncomfortable mix where disinflation slows before households have really recovered. For regular Americans, the first visible sign is obvious. The weekly fuel bill starts hurting again. But the real damage is wider than that. If you commute long distances, your monthly budget tightens. If you drive for work, the hit is even faster. If your household is already carrying credit card debt, higher gasoline and grocery-linked costs eat directly into the money that could have gone toward paying balances down. And if diesel stays elevated, the problem spreads beyond driving. Food delivery gets pricier. Travel gets less realistic. Small contractors and local service businesses face higher operating costs. Retailers face new margin pressure. Families already living close to the line lose flexibility first, not last. This is also where the emotional effect matters. When households feel basic mobility getting expensive again, they do not just complain about gas. They start turning cautious. They delay purchases. They pull back on dining, travel, upgrades, and optional spending. The budget adjustments begin before the full inflation pass-through is even visible in the data. That is how an oil shock can weaken consumer behavior early. The mood changes first. The broader slowdown can come later. Now, there is an important counterargument. Some people will say the United States is not as vulnerable to oil shocks as it used to be because America is a major energy producer. And that is true up to a point. The U.S. has much more domestic production than in older oil shock eras. It has more capacity, more resilience, and more cushioning than a simple import-dependent model would suggest. But that does not mean Americans are insulated from global oil pricing. Oil is still a global market. American producers may pump domestically, but prices are still shaped by global supply risk, shipping disruption, and world benchmarks. So the common misread is this. Because America produces energy, America cannot really get hit by an oil shock. That is too simplistic. The better way to say it is this. America may be more resilient than in the past, but it is not disconnected from global oil pricing, and households still pay global risk prices at the pump. So what happens next? There are really three paths. In the first path, this oil spike fades relatively quickly. Tensions ease, shipping risk improves, and crude pulls back. If that happens, the inflation damage may stay concentrated in energy and not fully infect the broader disinflation story. In the second path, oil stays elevated for longer but does not spiral much higher. That would still be enough to hurt household budgets, keep inflation progress messier, and make the Fed more cautious about easing. That may be the most realistic, uncomfortable middle scenario. In the third path, the shock worsens. Shipping disruption deepens. Fuel prices keep climbing, and inflation expectations rise further. That is a scenario where the Fed looks even more stuck. Not because it wants to punish the economy, but because it cannot declare victory over inflation while energy is reinfecting the system. And that is the core verdict. The most dangerous part of an oil shock is not the headline itself, it is the chain reaction. Because once fuel starts rising again, the question is no longer just how much will it cost to fill the tank? The bigger question becomes, how much longer will America have to live with expensive money? And that is why this story matters. Not just for markets, not just for economists, but for regular Americans trying to figure out why relief keeps feeling one step away.